Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will focus on a new book by UCLA historian Carol DuBois, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, a timely subject given the impending US elections. Dr. DuBois, congratulations. And welcome to the Washington History Seminar. And let me just say she had prepared for a somewhat longer presentation, so she's doing this a bit more ad hoc than she had hoped to. We're also very fortunate to have two scholars to begin our discussion of the book, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin of Miami University of Ohio and Marcia Chatlin of Georgetown University. A warm welcome to you as well. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I'm delighted to be co-chairing this seminar with Eric Arneson of George Washington University, who directs the National History Center. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative, decade-long effort of two organizations, the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the National History Center of the American Historical Association. Prior to the pandemic, we met on a weekly basis at the Wilson Center in person, but we're now very pleased to come to you via Zoom and Facebook. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Peter Bierstecker of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. Our thanks to both of them. We also like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest at Villanova University and the George Washington University History Department. I'd like to thank them for their financial support. We're also grateful to a number of individual donors who make these meetings possible and whose ranks we invite you to join. Details about how to do so are available in the chat right now, or simply go to our institutional websites. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of this webinar, we ask you to please use the raise hand function in the Zoom room if you'd like to ask a question. Once you'll get put into a queue. Once the moderator calls on you, you will receive a prompt to unmute yourself. Please do so, and then you have the mic. You also may submit questions to Rachel Wheatley via email at rwheatley@historians.org, rwheatley@historians.org. And with that, let me turn the Zoom room over to Eric Arneson. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. I am very pleased to be introducing our main event, our main speaker for this afternoon, Carol DuBois, who is Distinguished Research Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Educated at Wellesley College and Northwestern University, she has long been one of the nation's foremost historians of women's suffrage and women's history. Her first book on the subject was Feminism and Suffrage, The Emergence of an Independent Women's Movement, 1848-1869, published in 1978. She won the Joan Kelly Gadol Prize from the American Historical Association for Harriot Stanton Blatch and the Winning of Woman Suffrage in 1987. And today we will be discussing the book that was published earlier this year, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, the first comprehensive history of suffrage, published since 1959. And with that, the Zoom room is yours, Professor DuBois.
Thank you. Well, these are just a few notes I scribbled, so I hope you will forgive me, and that we can, things I've forgotten to say will come up in the discussion. I wrote this book, obviously, in anticipation of the suffrage centennial. I knew somebody was going to write a comprehensive history, and I saw them taking all of my books putting them in front of them. So I thought, I'm going to write that book. But this was going to be a different kind of book than I'd ever written. It was going to be a, quote, trade book. I was going to write it for a general audience. I must say this was a pleasure because it kept me from having to write extensive footnotes of engaging in debates with sister scholars. Although I did my very, very best to incorporate the full range of available scholarship, albeit in 300 pages. So I think I've done a reasonably good job of giving this history, which is both long, 75 years, and wide, involving both efforts to get the right to vote at the national level and numerous efforts to secure the right to vote at the state level. I've also tried to incorporate both familiar characters, but also unfamiliar characters. I have said, oh, let me say one more thing. So I wrote this, I planned this for the suffrage centennial. And of course, when I planned it, I thought, oh, good, we're gonna have a woman president. That'll be a nice capstone. Well, that didn't happen. And instead, what we had, and you'll forgive me if I get a little political, we had we are in the midst of, as a historian, I'd say the greatest threat to the American Republic and American democracy since 1861. I tell, when I talk about this to popular audiences, I use this as a chance to talk about what we would call historiography. In other words, that the meaning of great historical events, of which I would label the women's suffrage movement, great historical events changes depending on where you stand at the time that you consider it. That's what we know to be historiography, that writing history is a dialogue between the past as we look at it and the present in which we stand. You know, this is very hard for popular audiences who think anytime we make such changes, we're that horrible word called revisionist. I'm gonna just give one little example. When I wrote this book, I barely said anything about the 1918 flu pandemic. And then when it came time to talk to popular audiences about it, it was obvious I had to address it. So that was a very immediate example of something in the past that I had not paid attention to until something in the present brought it to my attention. I have said that this is, as Eric has said, it's the, I've called it the first comprehensive evidence-based history of women's suffrage since Eleanor Flexner's Century of Struggle. Now, there have been other histories of suffrage, smaller, larger, but I think be interesting if people think this is an unfair claim, but some of you may have seen that I was lucky enough to be able to write one of these overlooked obituaries of Eleanor Flexner in a week ago's New York Times. And I must say, I got more attention to that than anything else I've written, even in other equivalent publications. You know, it just was so clear that Flexner was such an enormous, had such enormous impact on any of us working in this subject. I just say a couple issues that I've struggled to address, or that I think stand out in this history I've written. I have tried to recapture what I have called, and I'm following my dear friend Ann Gordon, the universal suffrage period in American suffrage history, running more or less from 1866 to about 1888. And this is an effort to secure women's suffrage by securing at the constitutional level the right of all national citizens to vote. Those efforts failed. This leaves us in the terrible position that we are currently in, where states continue to control the right to vote, and especially with the Voter Rights Act being taken apart, there is absolutely no congressional control over state voter suppression. It is only after the failure of those efforts in the sort of the late 1870s that the women's suffrage movement shifts to what we call the 19th Amendment. It would have been the 16th when they introduced it. And it was, of course, exactly patterned on the 15th Amendment. There are some historians who claim that the 19th Amendment was written by Stanton and Anthony as a kind of exclusive version of the right to vote. First of all, it was introduced by Andrew Sargent, and I probably have his first name wrong, the senator from California. And it's clearly just an exact replica of the 15th Amendment with all the weaknesses that that had. Second, I've tried to, and in my presentations do this, really emphasize the importance of what are sometimes dismissed as state campaigns for women's suffrage. And these ran energetically from basically Wyoming and Colorado in the 1890s all the way up to the crucial state victory of New York in 1917. I have done my very best to emphasize that in these campaigns, when they were successful, for instance, in my state of California in 1911, women got full voting rights, including all the way up to President of the United States. And what this meant was that by the middle of the 1910s, something like, I think, 14% of women in the United States were voters in national elections. And that and a terribly inviting leverage for especially the National Women's Party, which began to try and search for a lever to bring a constitutional amendment back to the federal Constitution. Okay, two other points. First of all, one of the reasons that I feel I have a right to call this an unusually comprehensive history is that I did my best to include both the National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association in the last 7 years of the campaign. Actually, most suffrage histories, which only look at sort of one period or the other, but let's take those that look at the last decade, they really concentrate on either one side or the other, basically being partisans. It's amazing how much the divisions in the suffrage movement continue to have their partisans to this day. And I did my best to include both National Women's Party and NAWSA, lobbyists and direct action. Now, you know, so then which was responsible for the vote? Well, the easy way to say they both made their contribution, and most people say that. I have to say that actually following Flexner, I found myself particularly, the National Women's Party contribution gets the biggest, its tactics were much more showy and they speak to us today. But I must say that as I investigated the lobbying efforts of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, especially the work of Maud Wood Park, the leading lobbyist, I was extremely struck by the cleverness, what's the right word I want to use? The sophistication of the political know-how of these lobbyists. They, in her book called Front Door Lobby, Maud Wood Park gives a list of instructions she gave to her lobbyists, which could still stand for us today. Always knock on the door of a male congressman. There were only male congressmen. Only knock on the door of a male congressman so that you wouldn't, you know, embarrass him by walking in on him. Make friends with the secretary. Write your notes in the ladies' room when you're done. And do not let your anger or humiliation get the better of you so that you do not close the political opportunity for the next lobbyist. Finally, I have done my best to address the racial issues, which have become more and more, have brought more and more attention to the suffrage movement. Indeed, we would have to say that in this year of the centennial, if at least we look at the paper of record, the New York Times, almost its entire coverage focuses on racial issues, both the racism, I would have to say somewhat overstated by the long suffrage movement, and to my mind, the more important issue, which is the sustained activism of women of color on behalf of the suffrage. I think I've done a reasonably good job. I had to do this in the absence of Kathleen Cahill and Martha Jones's work, which hadn't yet appeared. I think I've done a reasonably good job on African Americans, but there is still work to do, and I don't think I know enough yet, especially for Latinx voter suppression in the post-1920 years. So I have to say, I think that work is incredibly important. I think Tom Dublin is on this call. He's one of the participants, and the work that he and Kitty Sklar have done to bring hundreds, that is to say, hundreds of African-American suffragists out of the shadows and into historical attention has been invaluable. So I think with that, I've come in under 15 minutes, I think. That was, you know, like when you sometimes teach a class and you think, oh my God, I forgot my notes. Well, this is sort of the way I did this. So please give me the benefit of the doubt, and I look forward to what Marcia and Kimberly have to say.
There's a lot more in this book, and hopefully in the discussion that follows, we will at least touch upon many of the other points, as well as the issues that you've just raised right here and now. We have two discussants this afternoon. I will introduce them as they speak. The first is Kimberly A. Hamlin, an associate professor of history at Miami University of Ohio, where she teaches classes on women's history, the history of sex and gender, and the Me Too movement. She received her BA from Georgetown and her MA and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of From Eve to Evolution, Darwin, Science, and Women's Rights in the Gilded Age, America, University of Chicago Press in 2014, and more recently, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, published this past year by W.W. Norton. She regularly contributes to the Washington Post, the NEH Humanities Magazine, the Smithsonian Magazine, and other popular media. And with that, Kimberly, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that introduction and for inviting me to be here today. I'm so honored and thrilled to be discussing Ellen's new book with Ellen and all of you. I'm really honored. Thank you, Ellen, for the visual of my new book. I forgot mine today, so I appreciate that. I want to start with just thank you. I want to start with placing Ellen's most recent book in the context of her previous books, not all of which I can fit in my one hand, but I think we need to say about Ellen, a word about Ellen's own kind of historiography and development as a scholar, and the extent to which we all, and by we, I mean those of us who are women's historians, voting rights historians, the debt to which we all owe Ellen in charting this territory for us over the course of her career, in assembling the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and editing them and collecting them and finding them and providing an accessible outlet for the rest of us. And then I want us to think about how Ellen's scholarship has changed over the years. And I also want to ask her how her thinking has changed since she first wrote Feminism and Suffrage, and then to her biography of Harriet Stanton Blatch. And also my personal favorite, I have to say, is Woman Suffrage and Women's Rights, and the essays collected therein. And then my favorite of all of those is Taking the Law into Our Own Hands, the chapter that's about the Minor v. Happersett decision and what happens when women like Victoria Woodhull begin to argue that in fact women already are enfranchised under the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment, and then what happens to the movement when the Supreme Court decides in fact we are not. I love that chapter. I think that is extremely perhaps one of the most relevant things we could be talking about today, like Ellen said, in reference to the fact of the failed congressional the failed House proposal to get to the Senate, making citizenship voting rights universal. So I want to ask Ellen I want to ask Ellen, when we think about your historiography for a minute, and when we assess your body of scholarship over your career. I wonder if you could walk us through some of the questions that have shifted in your mind, and how the archive itself has changed. That's my first question. Eric, should I ask all of my questions at once, or should I go back and forth?
That's a good question. How many questions do you have?
I have 3.
Why don't you lay them out?
Okay.
And we can go back and take them in order.
Give me all 3. That way I can do the
Okay.
ones.
Okay. So I have like a sub question for question 1. Sub question for question 1 is, I wondered why still start with 1848? So, so much new scholarship inspired by Lisa Tetroat's path-breaking book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, is really disrupting this 1848 75-year-long chronology. And I noticed, I wanted to ask what's still important about starting with 1848 and adhering to this 75-year timeline. Question 2, I want to ask about temperance. I noticed of all the themes that make an appearance in suffrage that I hadn't noticed as being as big a players in your earlier work, I saw the temperance movement playing a bigger role in suffrage. Why include that now? Why not include it earlier? My next project is also on temperance, so I am in support of this plan, but I also think for me, temperance is a shorthand way to talk about sex and sexual assault. And I wondered if that also played into your thinking about why incorporate temperance now. And related to temperance, I wondered also if you think previous historians have downplayed its significance to the suffrage movement because it advocated what to modern eyes and ears sounds conservative with its messages about home protection, if that you thought played a role. Third, as historians of suffrage and as we are experiencing the suffrage centennial, I wonder if you can situate us here and help us think, what are the next generations of suffrage historians going to write and talk about? What are the next sets of questions we should be answering? And in thinking of this question, I'm also inspired, Ellen, by another article of yours that I love, which is Making Women's History, Historian Activists of Women's Rights from the 1880s to 1940. I love that essay. That maybe is my second favorite of yours. And I feel like we too, those of us who are writing about the suffrage movement at the suffrage centennial, are also historian activists, right, in some ways. So what's going to look different at the next anniversary? What questions will suffrage historians be asking then?
Wow. Okay. I'll ramble around there. Let me start with the first big question. First of all, thank you for your incredibly kind words. I do think it's important to say that I brought together a small set of the writings of Stanton and Anthony in my reader. Of course, the work that's been done to assemble them was the work of Anne Gordon and many of her colleagues. And when you want to ask me how the archive has changed, from my point of view, I guess there would be 2 important elements to the changing archive. One is the absolutely comprehensive Stanton and Anthony collection. I can't get into the library, so I can't get into the microfilms. I can only use the, selected papers. But I'm going to be writing a biography of Stanton, and I need to get into the microfilm. And it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful, except now the National, what's it called? The National Historical Publications and Records Commission. I don't think it's funding things anymore. Maybe I'm wrong. Are they, Eric? You know? But it would be absolutely great if somebody would take on Carrie Chapman Catt's papers and do something like that. Because it's clear from the Stanton Anthony papers that that's basically a comprehensive history, a comprehensive set of archives up to 1906. The other, of course, great archival contribution is the work of, aforementioned work of Dublin and Sklar in their, let me see if I can say it, I know the initials. The Women's History Archives of the United States. No, maybe somebody can correct me. Yeah, Kimberly, can you do it? Sorry.
Oh, the Schlesinger? Is that what you're?
No, the Dublin SCLAR.
Oh, for the Women in Social Movements database?
Women in Social Movements. They actually have
the Women's Suffrage collection there, yes.
They have two big collections. One is the United States collection, and in the last 3 or 4 years, they have really concentrated on suffragists, and they have done an incredible job of using social media to get help in doing these hundreds of African Americans who were suffragists. Now they've also done other categories. So it's just an enormous addition. They also have another collection, which is an international collection, which I've used for my other work. Okay, that's how the archive has changed. My questions. Well, you know, as Eric pointed out, and as you pointed out, I've written about the beginning of this movement, and then I wrote about the end. And I initially started with Harriet Blatch because unfortunately, Elizabeth Stanton was mortal and died in 1902. So I picked up the story with her daughter, and I sort of stumbled on a really important character, somebody who sort of broke open the, I would say, tired emphasis on the Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul division. And I tried to argue that they had a lot in common. And but I hadn't really dealt with the middle period. And this brings us to your temperance question. In trying to fill out the period from about 1880 to 1900 at least, I don't know why I came to understand how important the WCTU and the leadership of Frances Willard. I noticed that Richard White in his big book has given her a lot of attention. And it is true, in the very first work that I did, as you said, Kimberly, I just sort of, those are conservatives. You know, I had a kind of 1960s, I'm gonna write about the radicals, I'm not gonna write about the conservatives. Okay. I was just, first of all, she's an extraordinary character. How she did what she did, how she got that enormous organization, we must say, of relatively conventional conservative women and dragged them into the suffrage movement is just extraordinary. Okay, let's see. Why did I start with Seneca Falls? I'm gonna do something terrible. I don't know if Lisa's on this call. Let me see if she is before I do it. Okay. I really think that the taking apart of Seneca Falls as a artificial narrative, I just think it's way overstated personally. There would be, one could start, as many other people, including Chris Stanzel have said, one could start with the Grimke sisters. That might be a better place to start. I mean, there are other activists, Mariah Stewart, for instance. But when we want to get to women's rights per se, I don't know, this is something we'll have to talk about. I started in Seneca Falls because that's where the conventional narrative starts, and I was writing for a conventional audience, a trade audience. But when I give lectures about it, I really start in the late 1860s, because that's really when the suffrage movement starts. The right to vote is mentioned in Seneca Falls, but it is really not important until Black suffrage makes the issue of enfranchisement at the federal level in the United States Constitution, puts it on the table. And that completely changes the suffrage movement. Let's see. I guess I have two other things to say. You asked me about how has my thinking changed? First of all, I'm just going to say, I actually also think that what I did about the 14th Amendment argument of Susan B. Anthony and the other voting women of the 1870s I personally think it's my most important scholarly contribution. I've written about other things, but I think that introduced something new into the story, and I'm proud of that. The way my thinking has most changed from the beginning until this very moment is, of course, with respect to the role of race in the suffrage movement. In my first book, Feminism and Suffrage, which was written out of the influence of the women's liberation movement, I emphasized, one would have to say, this sort of positive side of the break in 1869 between Black suffrage and women's suffrage. I certainly seriously underplayed Stanton's racism. Then by the time I revisited this about 10 or 12 years later, once again, the larger political environment had changed. When I started to write, the Black Power movement was much more prominent than the feminist movement, and I wrote under that atmosphere. By the time I revisited this, feminism had become a more powerful movement, and the Black rights movement had begun to lose influence. And at that point, I revisited this time and talked much more about the negative implications of the break between the 1869 break and what it meant to break open the alliance between Black suffrage and women's suffrage. I continue to re-examine that in this book with an eye to new attention to both racism in the suffrage movement and the contribution of African-American women. You ask what can be done. I know like this much about Latinx women and this much about Asian American women in the suffrage movement. So that needs to be done. But I did a little presentation for the Massachusetts Historical Society a couple of weeks ago. And I focused in preparation for the Stanton biography on the 50-year relationship between Douglas and Stanton from when they met in 1840 to when he died in the mid 1870s. And for that purpose, I actually read more carefully what Stanton said in 1868 and 1869. And it's pretty terrible. So I'm going to have to figure out how to deal with this. I do not have a handle, and how to incorporate this in her biography to not make it be the story, but not ignore it. And I really don't even know that I have a handle, I would say, on what's true about her character and her beliefs and her personality. You can see that at various times in the 1890s, the same thing happens. When she's under a lot of stress and she's terribly disappointed, these attitudes break out again. But what are their roots? I do not think there's an easy answer. And so anybody who wants to give it to me, I'll take it. So I think that's it, Kimberly.
I wonder if you could say a teeny bit more about where you think suffrage scholarship is going. What you mentioned about women of color, that there's much more we can know and learn. Where do you think, in 25 years, if we celebrate at the 125th, what will we be talking about?
Well, again, to take my original point, depends on what's happening in 2025. That's what we'll be talking about. Maybe we'll have 1 or 2 or 3 women presidents. Maybe, please God, there will be a diminution of political sexism. Maybe, on the other hand, maybe American democracy will be mortally wounded. For me, those are the questions more than the, suffrage historians will continue to explore. It's an incredibly rich movement. It's a quarter of American history. It enters into the history of every state, and there is much more to do. But in terms of what we will look at, it will depend on what we're dealing with.
Well, thank you. Our next discussant is Marcia Chatlin, who is professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. Her first book was Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, published by Duke University Press in 2015. And her recent franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, was published by Liveright W.W. Norton this past year. She is the current co-host of the Slate podcast, The Waves, which addresses issues of feminism, gender, and current events. An active public speaker and educational consultant, she has received awards and honors from the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as teaching awards from Georgetown. I could go on, the list of accomplishments is long, but I will now turn the Zoom room over to Marcia for her observations and questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. And it is such a pleasure to have spent a good portion of the summer engaging with Ellen on her work, as we both were participants in the PBS American Experience documentary, The Vote. And it's always great to see my good friend and role model, Kimberly Hamlin, who was kind enough to let me see an early copy of Freethinker and has helped me really understand suffrage from a perspective that I had not engaged with. My relationship to suffrage history is really through the experiences of African-American women who are forging political identities in this transitional period after the end of Reconstruction into the early 20th century. And so one of the things that I really appreciated about your work in this book, Ellen, is that you're really thinking about suffrage and political cultures. And so one of the questions that I was curious about is how did you understand the various strands of women's political culture in which women are forging their identities as members of the suffrage movement? And particularly, I think about this in terms of abolition. I think about the social justice identity of the Quakers. And I think of the various places in which women are organizing around various issues and how that prepares them to take up the work of suffrage. Additionally, you made some points in your opening comments that I think are so important for people who are trying to have a more nuanced understanding of suffrage in terms of the regional story and the national story. And so in light of the anxieties about the factionalism of the Civil War and the struggle over slavery, how do you think questions of national unity inform the rhetorical strategies as well as the public education campaign about the issue of women voting in light of the fact that there's an expanding Western territory, there is a deeply resentful South, and then there's the political culture of the Northeast? And my final question is about the quote in the concluding chapter of the formal chapters before you write about the after story, in which you quote Maud Younger about the dawn of women's political power in America. After the ratification, how do you think women who were interested in politics and public life took the lessons from that struggle and how they would engage politically after the passage of the amendment?
Ellen, you are muted. Okay, there we go.
No, I was just mumbling to myself. Different strands of American political culture, national unity and regional fractionalization then and now, I assume you mean, Marcia? And then the dawn of women's political presence. I can't remember exactly Maud Younger's quote. Various strands of political culture. Well, I have a couple ways to answer that. Marcia's question draws our attention to how women came from issues to suffrage, abolition, temperance, activism. What do I think? I guess I think it's a combination of the fact that the truth of what Stanton said early on, which is that, you know, every question ultimately comes down every question is determined politically. And I mean, I guess the Temperance story really points that out. Also, I would say it's the work of the suffragists themselves to constantly being reaching out. Anthony is particularly good at this, reaching out, drawing in, I apologize for my 19th century focus, drawing in different groups of women. I guess I want to sort of address it in two other ways. One is, I would also say it's the case that women move from suffragism to other issues. And if you look, this actually goes to your last question. If you look to where, first of all, it's never the case. It's almost never the case, maybe with Alice Paul. It's almost never the case that suffragists are single issue people. They all, each and every one, has some sort of general sense of the political world that they wish to be able to enter with other women with more tools. So after 1920, what happens to these very accomplished women? Well, they move into all kinds of movements. They move into leadership of the African American movement. They move into very much into the leadership of the labor movement. They move into birth control and they move into peace. And all of those movements are really hard to understand without the prior experience of their leaders in suffrage activism. Finally, and I don't think this is what you meant by the question, but I'm going to address it anyhow. When I and my generation first started working on suffrage, we inherited a framework from Eileen Creditor, talking about two different, you might call them political cultures, or certainly feminist approaches to suffrage. She called them equality, and sometimes equality and difference, sometimes justice, and what was the word she used that started with a P? Pragmatics, something like that. But she was making a distinction between those, and I'm not sure whether she thought this was a declension or an ascension, those who supported suffrage because it was an abstract right, and those who supported it because they wanted the right to vote to get other things. I guess she probably thought it was a declension. I think that's I've always been uncomfortable with that, and I think it's a false distinction. I think that it was certainly the case that in the beginning, especially as influenced by the school of anti-slavery, where these early suffragists learned about human rights, that they did emphasize the equality of human beings. Or to use another way they talked about it, how I think they sometimes talked about the differences of race and sex or skin or something like that as incidentals to the true inner humanity. That's a very, 1840s kind of Protestant way of looking at it. As we move further into the 19th century, we get more and more attention to how women will use the vote. And then there's this other difference, which I think Kimberly's work will really address, which is a shift in the culture from emphasizing the abstract equality of human beings to, and it's a kind of scientific development, to recognize the depth of willingness to look at gender. They wouldn't call it that, they would call it sex, but to look at men and maleness and femaleness as much more complicated phenomena. And that definitely has an influence on the suffrage movement, although I do not think that the notion of equality ever goes away. The second question is addressing issues of national unity versus regional difference. I guess the first thing I want to say is actually one of my favorite speeches is a speech called National Protection for National Citizens that Stanton gives in 1878. And it is a beautiful speech. And it is a speech in which she says, and I think it is still very relevant, in which she says that all of the differences, I'm probably not summarizing it very well, but all the differences of people, and she's not thinking, she might be thinking of individual differences as much as regional differences, but that but that she imagines that national government with its sort of lofty perspective is much more reliable for looking at the unity of all Americans rather than their differences. And I must say, when I first started my work, when it was once again a question of states' rights versus being able to rely on the national government to protect people of color, this I thought was a very important piece of work. I still think it's important. Again, I think questions of national versus state control over the suffrage is, along with the Electoral College, our biggest political burden. The question of differences in the aftermath of the Civil War, West, Northeast, South, Southeast. I'm not sure I've addressed it theoretically at all. I don't have, I think, a terribly convincing answer as to why state suffrage flourishes in the Western states in these years. It's easier to find the particular circumstances about the Northeast and certainly the South, where the trauma from their point of view of federal enfranchisement of African-American men is raw. It is, I guess you'd have to say, when you look at how the final generation, people like Kat and Paul, especially Kat, trying to figure out strategies in this period in which, after all, a Southern Democrat and his Congress are in charge of the federal government. I think we have to give them a bit of a break for wending their way through this situation to do something which might not have happened. I think it's important to realize there was no necessary reason why the 19th Amendment would have to be ratified in 1920. We could have been like France and had to wait another 25 years. So, okay, finally, how are we doing on time? Dawn of women's political, what was the noun, Marcia? Dawn of women's political, Maud Younger's quote, Dawn of women's political, your question. Anyhow, that 1920 was the beginning.
Yes.
Of women's political presence. And then you ask, what are the lessons in the engagement after 1920? I think I already talked about engagement. The suffrage movement itself breaks open over the question of the ERA, which is not resolved until enough women come into the labor movement in the 1970s to change the perspective of the labor movement. And then working class, labor, trade union activist women are the ones who take the lead in the ERA. But the question that people do ask is, why did it take so long? It was a good half century more before women's votes begin to come together in anything like either at least a bloc and at most a progressive presence. And that doesn't happen until 1980, the emergence and the recognition of what is called the gender gap. There was an article, I think it was in the New York Times yesterday, about how we shouldn't talk about a gender gap, we should talk about a white male problem. But my answer to that is usually what makes that happen is the emergence of a new feminist wave. That is what reinvigorates women's political activism. Even though sort of my wing of the women's liberation movement is a bit disdainful about electoral politics. Nonetheless, it is second wave feminism that brings back and unify, well, first of all, creates a kind of political awareness among a generation of women. And then I think there's no question that it's responsible for the progressive and the increasingly progressive quality of that awareness. So I need to swallow a little liquid.
Thank you. We're going to move into the question and answer portion of this webinar. And we will ask those of you who are watching and who wish to pose a question to use the raise hand function on Zoom or to email to rwheatley@historians.org if you want to communicate that way. We've got two people in the queue right now. And the first two people I will be calling on are Sonia Michelle and Glenna Matthews in that order. But I want to ask co-chair's prerogative, a question just to get us started in this portion. Obviously, today we live in a very divided age politically, a very contentious age is playing out all around us. The women whose activism you chronicle here also lived through many periods of contentious political argument and debate. And I'd like you to bring in the anti-suffragists into the discussion. They're there all along, but as the movement heats up in the progressive era and in the World War I era, you write in the latter part of the book that a number of prominent anti-suffragists, Charlotte Rao and Mary Wilson Thompson, their engagements show how far anti-suffragists had come since the early days of reluctant public involvement. They now undertook a level of political engagement rivaling that of the suffragists themselves. So could you just talk about anti-suffragism and how it changes, who these folks are, the arguments that they put forward, and why they resonated as strongly as they did for as long as they did?
Okay, that should have been another part of the answer to what work needs to be done. It's remarkable about how very little has been done on the question of anti-suffragists. I think some of your premises aren't quite right. I don't think they were there all along. They first appear, I believe, and Kimberly can correct me on this, in the 1890s, especially with respect to the New York campaign to change the state constitution. Of course, they show up very strongly in the final campaigns, especially in the state campaigns, and especially, of course, in the one campaign that has drawn the most attention, which is Tennessee. Me personally, I do not think that their arguments drew a particular amount of, were particularly influential. I think the real problem for women is that they didn't pay attention to politics, not that they were opposed to suffrage. Then this will lead to a distinction for now. I think that the anti-suffrage movement was powered by men. And one of the things I learned from this work is that when I try to answer why it took so long, for me, the answer is political parties and not women's opposition or general sexism or even men's opposition. I think it was political parties who were loath to to double the electorate in a way that they could absolutely not control the new voters. The new voters were, unreliable partisans. Your point about what I have to say about the antis in the final years, how far they had come. This is definitely true. They've basically they've learned the lessons of political activism. They are now political activists. And this links up to in what way we can say opposition to the ERA or opposition to abortion is different than opposition to suffrage. And the answer is that all women are enfranchised now. All women are political figures or have the capacity to be political figures. And the legacy of women's suffrage is not limited to feminist or progressive issues in any way, shape, or form. All we have to look at is Amy Coney Barrett, who's an incredibly sophisticated political actor who subscribes to, 12th century notions about womanhood. But she's not, afraid to leave her parlor. So we now have political movements. Now we have movements in which women are deeply divided over what constitutes the proper role of women. And they're all using political tools. Now, it is way beyond my my job description to be able to explain to you why the basis of women's opposition, especially to abortion, or let us say to explain white women's, especially white non-college educated women's support for the misogynist in chief. I can't explain that. I guess you'd have to say it's their class and their race that's influencing them. I don't think I would say they're following the lead of their husbands. Those women have become gun toters. I'm sorry, my politics are just spilling out, but what can I do? It's a week before the election. I do not, it would take modern people with sociological skills to get deeper into what kind of divides there are between women over contemporary feminist issues.
Thank you. And as we go forward, Kimberly and Marcia, feel free to join the conversation and add things if you wish. Just unmute yourselves and enter the conversation. So first up is Sonia Michelle. If you would unmute yourself, Sonia, you may pose your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I can hear you, but I can't see you, Sonia.
I know. I don't think you can see me.
No, we can only hear you. We can't see you.
You're not allowed to see me, Ellen. We'll just have to start meeting a different way. First, it's great to see you and congratulations on your book, which I am embarrassed to say I have not yet read. I raised my hand and then you
Sonia, as long as you've bought it, I really don't care whether you read it.
I'm using it as a doorstop, right?
That's fine.
I raised my hand before you got to the end of your initial set of remarks, and you actually sort of started touching on the question, which is, what is the relationship? The question is, what difference did suffrage make? And you sort of started to answer it when you talked about the emergence of the gender gap in the 1980s. But let me ask it again, and then you sort of reflected on it a little bit more in what you just most recently said about how to answer the question of why women vote as they do. So let me just ask you to kind of reflect a little bit more on what difference did having the vote make, and maybe there are other times in the history between 1920 and 1980 when a women's bloc of one kind, or there was some kind of gender gap. If you can see a time when that happened, and I was going to ask you something else, but anyway, just kind of focus on that a little bit. Obviously, I'm sure you're not an essentialist. You don't think that women.
Well, I guess I would say, to me, the question answers itself today, where people are, going to the mattresses over the right to vote, and where Trump tries to convince suburban women, whoever they are, to like him, and where women of color will do a large part for carrying the day. I feel like, I don't know, that question has always been hard for me to grapple with or answer, because I don't know how to answer it. Where would we be without the right to vote? We would be non-citizens. This is an odd thing to say, but even African Americans at least had de jure right to vote, and could fight de facto. If we had not won de jure suffrage, where would we be? Now, is there any other time? Well, I think there's a little moment. I personally think that women voters might have played a role in the 1932 political realignment in favor of the Democrats. I personally think that, but there's very little evidence to show that. It's really hard to follow even how women voted, much less why, until at the very least the emergence of exit polling in the 1940s. So we do know probably that women, it seems to be the case, I'm not sure I completely trust it, that women were through the 1950s at least disproportionately or inclined to Republicans. I do remember that in the Kennedy election in 1960, they put a lot of energy into trying to get women voters. That's sort of why they got Eleanor Roosevelt out and dusted her off to try to draw women into voting for Kennedy. And I don't think just because he was a looker. That's my answer, Sonia.
Thank you. But could I just ask a quick follow-up? I mean, maybe another way of getting at this is, I mean, as you said, I think quite rightly, today, both conservative and liberal or progressive women look to automatically, look to politics and look to the vote as a way of getting things done. But how do you think it became normalized? I mean, how did votes for women become normalized over the course of the 20th century, do you think? I mean, was there obviously less use of it. I mean, didn't they used to say women just voted the way their husbands voted? And now
that was bullshit, really. I mean, sometimes they said women voted the way their husbands voted, and then sometimes they said they voted the opposite of the way their husbands voted, so they canceled them out. These were old arguments dating from before women had the right to vote. I think it looks like about 2/3 of women who could have voted registered in 1920, and the numbers slowly and steadily creeps up. I believe that's the answer. Excuse my foul mouth.
Thanks, Ellen. Take care.
Thanks, Sonia. Glenna Matthews has her hand up in the queue. If you would unmute yourself.
Okay, Ellen, well, first of all, congratulations. I am really struck by what you said today, that you think you were a little too quick to dismiss the other side after the schism in 1869. And I say this because I'm long been an admirer of Antoinette Brown Blackwell. I think that she was a major intellectual as well as Anthony, because that book that she wrote, The Sexes Throughout Nature, she took on, in that book, she took on Darwin and tried to argue against the notion that there was some kind of inherent, that women somehow were retrograde in the evolutionary process, that women were somehow a drag on the evolutionary process. And I mean, it's a really interesting book. And the other thing I wanted to mention is I've read the correspondence between Antoinette Brown Blackwell, lived to be 96, lived to vote in 1921, and she and Carolyn Severance, a California suffragist, their correspondence is at the Huntington, and they both vow not to die until they have had the right to vote. And they both made it. Carolyn Severance didn't live till 1920, but because she was in California, she lived till 1913. So anyhow, I just think that it would be good to take a look at some of the people who were on the other side in that schism.
By other side, you mean arguing for difference?
Well, no, I mean the people who were
ASA.
Yeah, ASA.
Of course you were right. by focusing on Stanton and Anthony and then Stone, I think I have been distracted because Anthony and Stone really hated each other. I know that neither Stanton nor Anthony had not only any animus towards Antoinette Brown Blackwell, but remained very close to her. I noted that Stanton invited Antoinette Brown Blackwell as the first woman ordained minister to work on the Woman's Bible. And also the two of them had the distinction of both having 7 children. I will mostly, I can say, I will take your encouragement. I will be encouraged by what you say and look closely at Antoinette Brown Blackwell and not be distracted by Stone and her husband. Kimberly, what do you have to say about this? Anything?
Yeah, I unmuted because Eric invited us to chime in, and because much of my first book, From Eve to Evolution, is about Antoinette Brown Blackwell and her world. So yes, to Glenna's point, I think there's a lot more to be said about Antoinette Brown Blackwell. And through her, we see a different version of suffrage that, you know, kind of merges, because she was best friends with Lucy Stone. They met at Oberlin, they married brothers, they remained close friends their entire lives. And her relationship with Stanton and Anthony. As Ellen mentioned, Stanton writes Antoinette Brown Blackwell this beautiful letter on the birth of her 7th child and says something to the effect of, like, you know, Susan B. Anthony will kill me for this, but like, I would not have one less than 7 babies, and you're, you know, good for you. So I think there is a rich history of personal relationships and activism, and especially the point I make in my first book is about the role of science in opening up these women's eyes to an alternative creation story. I think that from a 21st century perspective, we have lost sight of how central the Adam and Eve story was for generations, hundreds of years of people understanding the differences between men and women, right? And how that was used to keep women in the subordinate position. So evolution in many cases, especially the case of Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who leaves the ministry to become an amateur scientist, in part because of her work in science and her appreciation of evolutionary theory, opens up a whole nother realm of possibilities for what it means to be male and female, right? When you look at the animal kingdom, there's no natural precedent for patriarchy. We see a whole new array of domestic and sexual arrangements that women like Antoinette Brown Blackwell, so in The Sexes Throughout Nature, I love that so much. She draws our attention to the male stickleback who cares for and feeds the young, right? This disrupts the idea that to be female is to be domestic. So I think there's a lot more interesting work to be said and done about Blackwell and the role of science more broadly in 19th century feminist thought.
You know, I'll point out that, when Stanton's daughter goes to Vassar in an early class, she wants to be a scientist. She studies with Margaret Mitchell. And when she can't quite get into science, she goes into social science. I take both of your comments very much to heart. And I'm just going to order your first book, Kimberly, because I help in understanding that world. Michelle Mitchell has also done a good job in understanding that world from the viewpoint of African Americans. So that post-Civil War discovery of evolution. So thank you, Glenna.
And up next is Vivian Hoyden. If you would unmute yourself.
Hi, I've really enjoyed this talk tremendously. And I actually have 2 questions. I guess I'll read them both. My first one was that you mentioned in your new book, you try to show, you write about familiar characters, but also unfamiliar ones. And I was wondering, how come do you think they came to be unfamiliar or forgotten? And then my second question was, what do you think about the current general telling of the women's suffrage movement nowadays?
Hold on, I want to get my book so I can.
Sure.
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated story to tell. And if people are looking mostly at the existing secondary sources to write their history of suffrage, they're not going to talk about these women. We've learned more and more about them. The one that I wanted to look up that is my favorite, because of course I can't remember her name, is a woman from Colorado. Excuse me.
Clyde Hawley?
Ellis Meredith. Ellis Meredith, who was a Colorado, she was a Democrat in an age when almost all suffragists were Republicans. She was from Colorado. She was a second generation suffragist. She was a journalist. She was a woman who was both married and professional. And she came into the story because for me, I was trying to organize a chapter a lot around the Chicago Columbian Exposition. And she shows up and convinces Susan B. Anthony to come to Colorado for the second campaign. I think that there's much more to say about this. Again, the challenge is to get a comprehensive story that has depth as well as breadth. As we learn more and more about the incredible range of suffragists, I want to say one thing, which is in the dismissal of the work of Stanton and Anthony for their creation of an allegedly false narrative of women's suffrage, there's a tendency to dismiss the multi-volume history of women's suffrage, an incredibly unique source that the two of them and Matilda Jocelyn Gage put together the first 3 volumes, and then other people put together the next 3 volumes. These are just lists of suffragists at the state level. I'm sure Tom and his group have done the work on much of the work on this. But in each state, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of women who were suffrage activists, and they deserve our attention. My friend Ann Gordon has told me that one of the things that happened, I think this is the other part of your question, that one of the things that's happened in this year is that she started by looking at how local Rochester suffragists all ran to Susan B. Anthony's grave and put their "I voted" stickers on her grave. But she said elsewhere, all over the country, voting women have tracked down suffragists from their cities and counties and honored them. I think that's a great thing. The question is, how has this history been told?
Well, I was wondering what you thought of how it's currently told. And I mean, at the beginning, you had mentioned that it certainly leaves out certain narratives. But would you say it can say any falsehoods, or?
I'm going to actually go to the political side. The national celebration of suffrage has been conducted by a congressional commission that was appointed by congressional leadership and also by the Trump administration. So it's heavy on the conservative side. For instance, the president of the Susan B. Anthony list, which is an anti-abortion group, is on this commission. They proceeded to create a totally apolitical celebration, if you can imagine, of this most political of events. So what this meant is every state was to have its commission, and it was to celebrate the ratification. This included states like the state of Mississippi, which did not ratify the 19th Amendment until 1983. No mention of that in the Mississippi celebration. So there has been a kind of, I've got mostly an intellectual and academic audience here. I would say there's been a kind of reification of the suffrage movement that has burdened this celebration. It was only to be the case. Martha Jones has talked about how commemoration is always a problem. You know, what happened to poor Martin Luther King when he became a holiday? So I thought about this when I was, first of all, when Trump pardoned Anthony. She got up out of her grave, she spun around, and she tried to get to Washington and could not do it. He had no idea why she was found guilty. That she was found guilty because she tried to vote. And then when I watched the Republican convention celebrate the women's suffrage centennial by wearing white clothes, I thought I was going to write something, which I never did, called "To Whom Does the Suffrage Centennial Belong?" And my answer was, as I have said before, not unfortunately, it belongs to all women. All women have inherited the right to vote, and they can do what they want with them. No one, you know, it's interesting. There's never been, I wonder if anybody's going to disagree with this. There's never been a full-on effort to suppress the votes of women. I think other kinds of voter suppression, the voter suppression of African Americans has come down to women in certain ways, but no one has tried to take away the votes of women because they benefit everyone, as it were, and nobody will benefit or lose from trying to take, you know, the Iranian, what's it called, Republic, enfranchised women, I think in the 1960s. No one has, for all of the negative approaches to women in that nation, no one's tried to take, women sit in the parliament, they vote, they serve, because it benefits everyone and no one at the same time.
I'm looking here up. There was a hand that was up that just went down. So I'm going to go to some of the, oh yes, there's a hand back up again. Katrin Schulteis, if you would unmute yourself, you may pose a question.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned briefly in your opening comments, you mentioned the political circumstances that allowed the suffrage, the 19th Amendment to pass. And, you know, we always focus on, obviously the activism and the leadership were essential, but then there's always, there is a moment where it becomes possible. And you also brought up the French context, which is, you know, an area that I know more about than the American context, where they had to wait for that opening effectively after World War II. And then I'm thinking back on that old article from Paula Baker, which made such an impression on me in the 80s, where she talks about how it really is a matter of kind of political parties jockeying. And in a sense, she argues that they finally kind of allowed women to vote rather than women finally battering down the ramparts to the point where they won the vote. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in general, about this idea of when change, monumental change like this happens, like what are the circumstances that allow it to happen?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. First of all, the typical answer is World War I, women got the right to vote as a reward. I just don't think that's true. I think if anything, the war held up suffrage combined with the pandemic. What were the events, the political events? First of all, in November of 1917, the first state east of the Mississippi fully enfranchised women, and that was the largest and most powerful, most populous and most powerful state in the Union, New York. And in November of 1917, New York women got the vote. And 2 months later, the House of Representatives passed the bill that began the ratification. That, I think that's pretty easy to explain because the 40-something, 46, 45 members of the New York delegation were now obligated to women voters, and they all became pro-suffrage. Conversely, it took a year and a half before the Senate followed the House and passed the second part of the bill beginning the ratification process. And that seems to happen, that is helped by the fact of the midterms in 1918, where the Democrats finally lose control of Congress. So I don't think Paula is right, which is that the parties allowed women to vote, even though I understand why she's saying that. I think there was a real battle between the parties, and it was only at the point at which the Democrats realized that the Republicans were on the verge of being able to claim that they were responsible, that the Democrats even began to move in that direction. And even then, the opponents at the ratification level included conservative Republicans in Massachusetts and, of course, white supremacist Democrats. And other things that are often said is that Wilson needed women's votes to help him along the get the passage of the League of Nations Treaty. I don't think that's true either. I think that Wilson, Kimberly's second book really addresses this because her character there is the one who, literally was inside of Wilson's ear. And maybe you want to say something about what you think made the difference for Wilson.
Well, what made the difference for Wilson, I think, is that he hated Alice Paul so much, but yet Alice Paul made suffrage something he had to deal with. So he welcomed in Helen Hamilton Gardner, who also hated Alice Paul. So that, I think, creates an opening for the Nassau women to go to the White House. But what I was going to say is another vital step on the way to congressional passage, which is not often talked about, is the creation in September of 1917 of the House Committee on Women's Suffrage. So this obviously is super boring. It's not as sexy as protesting the White House. It gets a lot, it doesn't get the sort of attention, but because Nassau, in particular, Helen Hamilton Gardner and Maud Wood Park, who Ellen previously mentioned, worked so successfully with the White House and with Congress, they finally were able to get this House Committee on Women's Suffrage created, which they'd been wanting to get since the 1880s when they created a Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage. And why did they want it? Because this is the procedural measure that you need to get your amendment to the floor for a vote. So this House Committee wasn't created until the fall of 1917. And then, just like Ellen said, in January of 1918 is when the House first votes on and passes the amendment. Now, in terms of what else happens in 18, to just amplify Ellen's point that it's not World War I, right? Like everyone knows Wilson goes to the Senate on, I think it's September 30th, 1918, to give this impassioned suffrage as a war measure speech, which he does. And then if you look at what happens after Wilson and his entire cabinet, except for one, leave, no one changes their vote. The senators can't wait to get to the floor, not to engage with anything Wilson said, but to propose amendments clarifying that the 19th Amendment should only pertain to white women. So no senators take this suffrage as a war measure vote seriously. They don't even consider it. They go right back to states' rights the second that Wilson shuts the door behind him, to this point.
Something that Eleanor, I interviewed Eleanor Flexner, and something she said to me, which I can't quite follow through, but it's worth thinking about. It's sort of, I was leaving the place where she lived, and she said, don't forget the 17th Amendment, which is the popular election of senators. And the problem that I can't quite make that work is because senators were still at the conservative House and they slowed down suffrage. But I think that slowing down had a lot to do with the war. Nothing happened pretty much between April of 1917 and, November of 1918. So anyhow, I just thought I'd bring Eleanor into the story.
Thank you. We have a question that has come in over email. and from Myrna Goldenberg, who asks, would you discuss the issue of anti-Semitism in some of the feminist leaders of the suffrage movement? Were there noted Jewish suffragist leaders?
That's Myrna Goldberg, my cousin. Hi, Myrna. Yes, I just gave a lecture, not a lecture, I worked with Melissa Clapper to give a presentation on Jewish women in suffrage. In the 19th century, United States is such a Protestant country. And it's really until the late 19th century that you get any significant, then you begin to get significant numbers of women, of Jewish women. There's one important Jewish woman in the early 19th century. Her name is Ernestine Rose. She's a Polish Jew. She's a free thinker, meaning an atheist. I think she's tremendously influential in both Stanton and Anthony. And there does seem to be evidence that she's pretty much all by herself. She feels assaulted. I think I would say it's unclear whether it's anti-Semitism in particular or nativism in general, because she's very obviously an immigrant woman. She has a heavy accent. And she leaves the country in 1869, and it's a loss to the American suffrage movement. Then in the early 20th century, we get an enormous presence of Jewish and Italian American women in the female labor force. And they do a lot to transform the suffrage movement into a mass movement. Now, it is the case that some of the leaders, I think this is true of both Paul and Kat, were uncomfortable with Jews, and Italians too. Kat used to say she couldn't stand the smell of onions and garlic. I want to say to her, Carrie, that's that's what modern gourmets are built on, you know, garlic and onions. What about Stanton? In the 1894 defeat in New York, she has very nasty things to say about immigrants. On the one hand, I do not think she ever specifies Jews. They're not a very large group quite yet. On the other hand, when she puts together the Woman's Bible, I'm very struck with the fact that unlike most Christian women in the country who like to blame what they called Old Testament, you know, the Old Testament God for whatever sexism they found in the New Testament. That was just the influence of Judaism, whereas Jesus was the deity of love. She doesn't do that. She refuses to make a distinction between the Judeo and the Christian side of this heritage in looking for the sources of women's subordination. So she's part of that generation. She's learning from those new, you know, you talk about science, Kimberly. She's learning from those new scientific historians of the Bible to look at the Bible as an actual human written text rather than the word of God. So it may be my residual refusal to see problems with Stanton, but I'm not sure whether she or Anthony. Right, first of all, Anthony adored Rose. So I'm not sure, but there was no reason for them to be anti-Semitic when there's one or two Jews in the world that they live in. It's only when you move into an environment in which there are large numbers of Jews that anti-Semitism gets a purchase. And then at that point, Jewish men are too important an electorate to really go after.
All right, thank you very much. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. I think we could go on for quite some time to come, but I want to thank Ellen, Kimberly, and Marcia for your comments, observations, and questions. And I'm going to turn this over to Christian for final words. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. Let me just remind our viewers that we will meet again next week online, but not on Monday, on Wednesday, November 4th, when we will discuss Duke University historian Fabiola Glimpf's new book, The Women's Fight, the Civil Wars, Battles for Home, Freedom, and Nation. Thanks again to Ellen, Kimberly, and Marcia, and my co-chair Eric for a terrific conversation this afternoon. Thanks to our audience for watching and participating. We're adjourned. Stay well and be safe.